So Singer begins his discussion of racial discrimination by considering an argument that purports to show that race-based discrimination is morally wrong, which Singer says dates back probably to the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Now, I call this argument the irrelevancy argument, just so that we have a name for it. And Singer directs it specifically against racial discrimination. However, after I go through it, I'll talk about how it really provides us with a template for arguing against all sorts of types of discrimination based on irrelevant or arbitrary features of the individuals with regard to that treatment. So the first premise articulates the general principle that's going to drive the argument here. It says treating people unequally based upon facts that are irrelevant or arbitrary with regard to that treatment in question is wrong. And the idea here is that if you're treating people on the basis of, say, the amount of melanin that pigments their skin, when that feature of the individual is totally irrelevant to the situation or the activities in question, then that violates our sense of fairness or equitability, our sense of what's morally correct. Then the argument asks us to consider specifically racial discrimination. So it says, look, consider racial discrimination in the case of jobs, hiring, promoting, firing. In the case of education, who gets access to education, what kind of education, and so on. And with regard to voting. These are just examples, of course, but they are important services or rights that are provided by our society. And racial discrimination with regard to these would be treatment based solely or largely upon the race of the individual. But it noticed that the race of the individual, the amount of melanin that pigments their skin, for instance, is irrelevant to their qualifications for a job, their competency in performing a job, their qualifications to be educated, their ability to benefit from that education, and so on. Hence, the argument concludes, racial discrimination is morally wrong. This is the argument, essentially, as Singer presents it, focusing primarily on, or exclusively on, racial discrimination. But we can see that this first principle is really much more general, and that the argument provides us with a template for arguing against all sorts of discrimination based on irrelevant or arbitrary features of individuals or groups. And so we can imagine this argument going the same way when we consider irrelevant or arbitrary features like gender, religious beliefs, age, economic situation, and so on, with regard to various rights, privileges, and activities within society. And so this argument that I call the irrelevancy argument is really a more general argument against cases of arbitrary or irrelevant discrimination. And Singer embraces the argument. He doesn't say that the argument doesn't establish its conclusion. He doesn't disagree with that first premise of the argument or any of the premises of the argument. But Singer does object to the argument, and he builds his thesis around this objection to the argument. And his thesis in the paper is that the account of the immorality of racial discrimination that's provided by the irrelevancy argument here is inadequate. And he wants to suggest that there are many situations in which, from at least one point of view, the racial factor responsible for discrimination is by no means irrelevant in those cases. And since the irrelevancy argument bases its judgment about the moral worth of such cases, of such discrimination, on the relevance of the feature to the actions in the case, then it doesn't provide us with a reason for supposing that racial discrimination in these cases where the racial factor isn't irrelevant is in fact wrong. In other words, in situations where we find discriminatory behavior that isn't based on arbitrary and irrelevant features of an individual, like their race or their gender, but that in those situations, race or gender or sexual orientation aren't irrelevant, and the discrimination is based upon the perceived relevance of these features, then the irrelevancy argument has no way of judging these cases of discrimination to be morally wrong. But Singer says many of these cases do seem to be clearly morally wrong. And so he gives us an example to sort of drive that point home. So the first example that he's going to consider in the paper is a case of Nazi Germany. And he tells us, look, if the Nazi leader's purpose was to produce a world in which there were no Jews, then it was certainly not irrelevant to their purposes that those who were rounded up and mercilessly murdered by the SS were Jews rather than so-called Aryans. And so Singer notes that though not arbitrary or irrelevant from the point of view of the Nazis, the Nazi actions were obviously immoral. And he says a good theory of the wrongness of racial discrimination needs to be able to account for the immorality of these Nazi actions. If in fact we really can understand these Nazi actions as being based on features of a group of individuals that weren't irrelevant to the purposes of that case. And we can also see, again, the general concern that this raises for all sorts of arguments that we want to make against what we consider to be ethically blameworthy discrimination. Because the Nazis didn't just round up and kill people who were Jewish in ethnicity or religious conviction. They also rounded up and killed people that they labeled as gypsies. And they rounded up and killed people who they thought were homosexuals and lesbians. And so sexual orientation as well as ethnicity on this account, or this characterization of Nazi actions, weren't irrelevant to the purposes of the Nazis. They drove a particular discriminatory practice, a brutal and morally despicable practice. But that practice wasn't based on irrelevant features of those groups. And so the irrelevancy argument doesn't help us to understand why it is that these actions were morally despicable. And any good account of why racial or other discrimination is immoral is going to have to be able to give us a clear and straightforward answer as to why the Nazi actions are immoral. And so this is how Singer raises this problem in the context of the article.